a new proposition that is neither the same nor substantially the same as that disposed of by the House on the 12th of March, this would be entirely in order. What the government cannot legitimately do is to resubmit to the House the same proposition, or substantially the same proposition, as that of last week, which was rejected by 149 votes. This ruling should not be regarded as my last word on the subject. It is simply meant to indicate the test which the government must meet in order for me to rule that a third meaningful vote can legitimately be held in this parliamentary session. Order.
Point of order.
Yes, indeed. Point of order. Yes, point of order. Sir Peter Bottomley.
Mr. Speaker, can I put 3 points following your helpful statement? The first is must and not the word may. And the second, or the first 2 points, the third point is this. When Sir Ian Gilmore put forward a provision, in effect for putting carpets and coffee in betting offices, the Puritans objected, so withdrew the bill, and shortly afterwards a bill called Miscellaneous Provisions Bill was passed because no one noticed it. It had to do with coffee and carpets in betting shops. There are times when the title has changed, and perhaps if the long title changed, something the government put forward might be accepted by the chair, rather than must be ruled out.
Well, I'm not sure there were 3 points there. I detected only 2. I don't wish to be unkind or discourteous to the right honourable gentleman, whom I hope I always treat with the utmost respect, but I am somewhat foxed and befuddled by his first observation, which wasn't as overpoweringly clear to me as manifestly it was to him. I certainly referred to Erskine May. I wasn't conscious that I had used the words may early in my statement and must at the end of my statement in a way which would brook of contradiction or indeed be open to the suggestion that they were contradictory. If the right honourable gentleman wishes to labour under that impression and can subsequently convince me over either a cup of coffee or a cup of tea that I have erred in some material respect, then I would say to the right honourable gentleman that I shall always be prepared to profit by his counsels. As far as the point in respect of the Lady Ian Gilmore is concerned, I am not familiar with that particular example. I suspect that it would be interesting reading, and I will add it to my list in the period of days that lies ahead. And I thank him for what he said and the courtesy with which he has said it. I will come to the right honourable gentleman. I might perhaps go to the chair of the European Scrutiny Committee, Sir William Cash.
Mr. Speaker, it seems to me that what you've said makes an enormous amount of sense, given the fact that actually this has been defeated on 2 separate occasions. And unless there is a substantial difference, it must follow that what you have said in a very important statement makes an enormous amount of sense. I just wondered one thing with regard to the precedent of 1604, whether there was any connection between that and very shortly afterwards was the gunpowder plot.
Well, the honourable gentleman is a far superior historian. He may know. I will not say. And I appreciate also his sense of humour on what is nevertheless an extremely important occasion. But I thank him for what he has said. I have always respected the honourable gentleman as a principled and indefatigable parliamentarian. In fact, I think across this House, whether people agree with the honourable gentleman or not, they know of one thing which I once said, as he knows, on the occasion of Her Majesty the Queen's visit to this place, and directly to her, that the honourable gentleman, the member for Stone, speaks and votes only and always as he thinks the national interest requires. There can be no greater compliment to a Member of Parliament than to say that to him or her. A point of order, Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank you for your statement this afternoon. We do indeed live in interesting times. However, I think it is fair to say, Mr. Speaker, we are in a constitutional crisis, and I seek your advice and how we can convey a message to the government that the issue of leadership is now most important and indeed imperative. And what can we do to unveil upon the Prime Minister that she must immediately call a meeting of all opposition leaders in order that we can react to this crisis and find a way ahead? And moreover, that the Prime Minister must immediately meet with the heads of government in Edinburgh and in Cardiff.
The honourable gentleman has made his point with force and alacrity. It's not, I think, for me to say who the Prime Minister should or shouldn't meet, but that point is registered, it is on the record. If I know the right honourable gentleman as well as I think I do, it will be repeated by him with some passion and vociferousness in the days ahead, and not least because of the force with which it is articulated again and again and again. I feel certain that it will be heard. Whether it's heeded remains to be seen, but it will be heard. Yes, a point of order, Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, may I say how delighted I am that you have decided to follow precedent, which is something I am greatly in favour of. And dare I say, there is more joy in heaven over one sinner who repenteth than the 99 who are not in need of repentance. But I wondered if he might help the House with 2 points of clarity. The first is, would his indication today prevent the second reading, or even the first reading, of the so-called Wade Bill that may have the same effect of confirming the meaningful vote? And would I be right in thinking that a new session after a prorogation would allow the motion to be returned to the House?
Well, I think that the House would decide on the principle of the Wave Bill at second reading if we got to that point. The point that the honourable gentleman makes, and the, if you'll forgive me saying so, partly rhetorical question accompanying it about post-prorogation and a new session, seems to me to be self-evidently valid. I am not advocating that, but that point is self-evidently valid. And I thank the honourable gentleman for what he said. I will come to the right honourable gentleman because the right honourable lady raised a point of order with me. Perhaps I can identify Angela Eagle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And will you confirm to the House today that the point of this ruling in Erskine May was to stop the bullying of the legislature by the executive and to exclude the facts that MPs may be either being strong-armed, bullied or bribed with issues such as the sacking of the current civil servant who's been in charge of the Brexit negotiations, who, by the way, actually predicted when overheard in a Brussels bar that what we've seen, meaningful vote 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ad infinitum, would be their way of getting this botched deal through the House, but that the Erskine May rules are precisely to avoid the kind of spectacle that we have been witnessing in the last few months. And will he take the government's other behaviours, ignoring votes of Parliament, making a distinction between votes which somehow are binding and not binding, refusing to grant opposition days, beginning not to vote in opposition days and to ignore those issues that are actually passed by this House which have devalued Parliament's opinion? And will he say to the House today that he is going to take account of all of this behaviour as he judges meaningful vote 3 and any motion which the government may bring forward?
Well, I'm very grateful to the right honourable lady for her point of order. I will reflect very carefully on what she said to me. She's an extremely experienced and seasoned parliamentarian and, of course, a former shadow leader of the House. So I will factor into my thinking the considerations that she has adduced. I don't think that there is one single rationale for the emergence and continuation of the Convention. I touched upon some of the thinking behind it in my statement. I think it would be true to say that a concern with the judicious use of parliamentary time when that time is finite and the avoidance of its wastage is an important factor. Another important factor, colleagues, is ensuring clarity and consistency so far as the statute book is concerned. Associated with, underlying all of that, I think there is a concept of respect for the importance of decisions made by the House and weight to be attached to them. So I will reflect very carefully on these matters, and I very gently say to the honourable gentleman, member for North East Somerset, because I failed to respond to that point, and it was a very good and wittily delivered one. So far as tradition is concerned, he has a perfectly fair point. A tradition does matter. It is important. What I would say to him is, just because it isn't desirable to follow precedent in every case, irrespective of circumstance, doesn't mean that it is justified not to follow it. It depends on the particular circumstance. It depends, for example, whether one is facilitating the House and allowing the expression of an opinion which might otherwise be denied, as was the case on the 9th of January. In this case, of course, where we are talking about the same question rule, I have already explained that this matter has been treated of by the House, and therefore the question of whether a subsequent motion is the same or substantially the same is a live matter for consideration and judgment at the appropriate time. In fact, that seems to me to be so obviously commonsensical an observation that only an extraordinarily sophisticated person, perhaps bereft of such common sense, could fail to grasp it. And the honourable gentleman most certainly wouldn't fall into that category, because he is both extraordinarily sophisticated and blessed, I feel sure, with a very large supply of common sense. Point of order, Mark Francois.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You have said memorably in the past that sometimes we have to take the rough with the smooth. Well, it seems to me today that that applies to others. Can I ask if this principle applies in other contexts as well? So, for instance, the House voted a few weeks ago on what became known as the Cooper-Bowles Amendment to overturn Standing Order 14.1, essentially to take control of the order paper for a day. That was rejected. Last week, the House then voted against what became the Benn Amendment, but which was, I would argue, substantially similar to the original Cooper-Bowles Amendment, to take control of the order paper and override Standing Order 14.1. Now, you on that occasion, sir, judged that it was permissible to ask this question because it was not exactly the same as the first one. But could I offer you a thought that if there were to be a third variant of that, if it were to be substantially the same, then to be consistent, sir, you would have to rule that out too.
Well, I'm always grateful to the right honourable gentleman. I've often reminded the House, and I say for the benefit of those attending to our proceedings, that I first came to know the right honourable gentleman in September 1983, when I unkindly and wrongly suggested that he was intellectually knee-high to a grasshopper. That was very unfair of me, and to the great credit of the right honourable gentleman, he didn't appear to bear any grudge, and we've got on pretty well over the ensuing 35 and a half years. I always listen to his advice. The answer is, everything depends upon context and circumstance. Oh yes, of course it does, manifestly. And incontrovertibly it does. It isn't a question of abstract principle or wallowing, as Edmund Burke would say, in the realms of metaphysical abstraction, but attending to circumstance. And I would look at that with the important considerations and principle of which he's reminded me in the forefront of my mind in making a judgment. He's absolutely entitled to raise that point, and I would indeed have to weigh very carefully whether a proposition was in fact the same or substantially the same, or whether it could credibly be contended that it was different. Thank you. Yes, indeed. I will come to the right honourable gentleman. Point of order, Anna Soubry.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is what happens when you don't seek consensus and of stubbornness and brinkmanship that has brought us to this point. Mr. Speaker, this has to be unprecedented, the crisis that's now upon the country. We're due to leave the European Union in 11 days and there is no plan, there is no certainty, and this country is crying out for it, especially business. Mr. Speaker, what would you now expect the government to do? Because we're relying on tweets and rumour and spin from Number 10. And as I say, the clock is ticking. There's no disrespect to those that sit on the Treasury bench, but there is no senior member here from government who can help us with a timetable. Mr. Speaker. With this department, with this portfolio. I said a senior member who can help us with a timetable.
Yeah, just like magic.
And now we have that senior member with a timetable. No disrespect to my honourable friend for Hastings and Rye. So, Mr. Speaker, what would you now expect so that we can have a timetable so we can make the progress to do the right thing now by the country in this crisis?
What I say to the Right Honourable Lady is threefold. First of all, there was already present in the Chamber before the arrival of the Leader of the House, whom we welcome to our proceedings, the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, who by any standard must be considered to be senior. I'm not going to get into a vulgar argument about the respective levels of seniority of different honourable and right honourable members, and there are different forms of seniority, of course, but the Right Honourable Lady for Hastings and Rye was already present and the Leader has now joined us. What I would say to the Right Honourable Lady is that I don't think it's for me to say what the government should do, but what I would say is that I think it would be helpful to the House to have the earliest possible indication of how the government intends to proceed in this important matter. Of course, we may learn more about the government's intentions as a result of the upcoming urgent question, which I have granted to the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Putney. That question was applied for to me this morning, and I have granted it, and I have every expectation that the Right Honourable Lady and many others will be in their places. So we will learn more anon. And as far as colleagues' dispositions are concerned, in other words, what they choose to do, how they wish to proceed, that, of course, is a matter for them. The role of the Speaker is to seek to facilitate the House, and, if I may say so, and I will, to have a particular regard for the concerns of backbench members who should be heard in this place. Part of the responsibility of the Speaker is, frankly, to speak truth to power. I have always done that, and no matter what, I always will, because I think that is the proper thing to do. Others can proceed as they wish, but I have never been pushed around, and I'm not going to start now. Point of order, Vicky Ford.
Speaker, and as a newish member of this House, thank you for the clarity of that statement and for also confirming that everything depends on context and circumstance, because since the vote last Tuesday, this House has obviously voted against a second referendum, against the Cooper-Bowles Amendment twice, and against a no-deal Brexit in 11 days' time. Are those the sort of decisions that, in your view, affect the context and circumstances on which this House might make its own decision?
I think the context is a freestanding matter. I think it depends on the situation at the time, and that is partly a matter of opinion, because all government, all influence of human beings upon another ultimately rests upon opinion. And I think it depends what the situation is more widely. So I know that the Honourable Lady wouldn't seek to entice me, because that would be unkind of her, and she wouldn't do that, to pronounce on other questions which are not today before the House. I wouldn't do that, but I would reflect on them in the circumstances of the time, and it's perfectly reasonable that I should be asked to do so if that situation arises. I do apologise to the chair of the Brexit Select Committee, whom I should have called several minutes ago. Point of order, Mr. Hilary Benn.
I'm very grateful. Mr. Speaker, in distinguishing between the character of the first meaningful vote and the second. In your statement, you drew attention to the fact that in the second meaningful vote, the government had brought back to the House additional documents and assurances and legal agreements that had not been contained within the first. Does your statement suggest in any way that in order for a third meaningful vote to not fall within the statement that you've just made, that it would require further changes to be agreed with the European Union, rather than, for example, the government saying, well, it's prepared to make an offer to, say, a particular party represented in this chamber about its participation in future arrangements? In other words, would there have to be new political agreement under Section 13(1) of the European Union Withdrawal Act in order for such a motion to be in order as opposed to not in order?
What I would say to the right honourable gentleman, whom I thank for his point of order, and preliminarily off the top of my head, is that in all likelihood the answer to his question is yes. I do think a demonstrable change to the proposition would be required. For example, simply a change in an opinion about something wouldn't itself constitute a change in the offer. And so I would have to look at the particulars, I'd have to make an honest assessment of the circumstances and perhaps of the competing claims made as to the veracity of one proposition or argument or another. But fundamentally, for something to be different, it has to be, by definition, fundamentally different. Not different in terms of wording, but difference in terms of substance. And this is in the context of a negotiation with others outside the United Kingdom. So that would be my initial feeling. Yes, indeed. Of course. I will come to the honourable gentleman. Point of order, Neil O'Brien.
Mr. Speaker, and I don't envy you in trying to make these difficult decisions. First, I wondered if I could press you on your understanding of substantively different. For example, were the government to come back with a proposition that they would write into law the Stormont lock, would that be substantively different? If there were to be commentary that changed our opinion of this at the European Council, would that be substantially different? I know that many members of this House already feel that having taken no deal off the table, something I voted against, already makes the situation substantially different, Mr. Speaker. So I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that. And secondly, Mr. Speaker, you listed some precedents, starting with 1604, which is very interesting to new members. Some members were here already. I was not as a new member. Of course, we are in an unprecedented situation, Mr. Speaker, in which we have voted for a referendum, given sovereignty to those who belong to the people, and we are now bound by that decision. And I would simply say to you, Mr. Speaker, how will you deal with this unprecedented situation? Because my constituents who are worried about their jobs or worried about losing the Brexit that they voted for will always prefer you, instead of rigidly sticking with precedents from 1604, to be a modern speaker for modern times who can not stand in the way of delivering the deal, the only deal I believe will solve this problem.
Demonstrated with the very greatest of respect to the honourable gentleman over a period of 9.5 years and more, that I am not a stickler for tradition. I do not believe in doing everything the same way forevermore, just because, as so many people have said to me, oh, Mr. Speaker, it's always been done that way, or, oh, we've never previously had X. I've been ready to countenance change. I remember once being told many years ago by a retired and senior clerk of this House that she was very pleased that I had secured support for the establishment of a nursery in the House, which members and staff could pay for. She just wanted to say to me she didn't know whether I was aware that throughout her 4-decade service in the House, the idea of such an established facility had periodically been discussed, but unfortunately nothing had ever happened. And that was not helpful for her in terms of work-life balance, her professional commitments and her childcare responsibilities. So I think I can say with the very greatest of respect that I have attempted to be a progressive change maker. so far as the particulars are concerned, it depends on the circumstances. It has to depend on the circumstances. I would have to look at the specifics. It would be reckless and foolhardy to pronounce in abstract. What I further would say to the honourable gentleman, just to remind him of the context of my statement, is that as far as the use of time is concerned, we have been addressing this matter for a period spanning 4 months. Insofar as time has been lost during that period, for example, at one point, a loss of 5 weeks, 5 weeks without the matter coming to the House, that wasn't as a result of fiat by the chair or folly by the House. It was the express decision of the government. I cannot off the top of my head remember for certain whether the honourable gentleman supported the government's position on that matter. I have a very high regard for his ability because he's an extremely able man. I hope he won't take offence if I say, in the nicest possible way, that he has always seemed to me to be a keen supporter of close regulatory alignment with the government whip's office. Yes, indeed. Mr. Mary Sherman.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank you for... Mr. Speaker, can I thank you for your guidance today? Here we are in the greatest constitutional situation and very grave situation that I've seen in my nearly 40 years in this House. And if it wasn't for your good guidance today and over the last few weeks, I think this House would have been very badly served indeed. But the fact of the matter, Mr. Speaker, is what you have said today has grave repercussions for the business of the House. And what is the advice from the Chair, or could we have an early statement from the Prime Minister or the Leader of the House? What is the next step? We're leaving the European Union. We have a few days. What is the best way that we can represent our constituents at this grave time of crisis?
The short answer is let's debate these matters sooner rather than later. Of course, the government, for the most part, controls the order paper. We know that, and the Right Honourable Lady, the Leader of the House, is the government's representative in the House. But there are, of course, situations in which members can give voice to their views, whether the government particularly wants that to happen or not. For example, on over, I think, 570 occasions over the last 9.5 years, I have seen fit to grant urgent questions, believing that that is in the interests of the House, beneficial to backbenchers and securing ministerial presence in the chamber so that the government can be legitimately questioned, probed, scrutinised, challenged and held to account. There will be further such opportunities today, and knowing the ingenuity of the honourable gentleman who will have served 40 years in the House in less than 2 months' time, I feel certain that he will be well up to the task of posing suitable inquiries and expressing his views on this matter in the days ahead. A point of order, Mr. Peter Bone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And of course, you're absolutely correct at what Urgency May says. A motion or an amendment which is the same in substance as a question which has been decided during a session may not be brought forward again during the same session. I think that is absolutely clear. And I was, sir, wondering when you allowed the second meaningful vote. I obviously you're ruling on it, but it was clearly a balanced decision on that occasion. But what this seems to be clear to me, sir, it is about the motion, whether it's substantially changed or not. It's not about whether something else has happened. That's irrelevant. It's what has actually happened to the motion. And of course, we do have the procedure in this House, Mr. Speaker, of the previous question. And I was possibly thinking of doing that. The reason we have the previous question is so that the same question can continue to be debated another time. So would you confirm that, sir, that it's about the substance of the motion, not something else happening outside?
It is about the substance of the motion, what it is commending to the House, what proposition is being put. It is not a question purely of the words, but of the meaning, of the intention, of the purpose. Yes, indeed. Point of order, Mr. Tom Brake. I do beg the right honourable gentleman's pardon. If I may, I'll just come to the Mr. Pete Wishart first, and then I'll come to the right honourable gentleman. Mr. Pete Wishart.
Very grateful to you, Mr. Speaker, and I think what you've made today is a very important and dramatic statement. And already constituents of mine are getting in touch with me asking exactly what that means. And I think we've got to be actually clear with the country with what you've said. The government cannot bring back another meaningful vote if it's the same substance as the last one. Now, the government's one and only intention is to achieve and secure that. This week, they were intending to do that very thing, and now you said that can't happen. So I think just to stress that clarity, Mr. Speaker, I think would be abundantly helpful. But my experience in this government, and I don't know if it's yours, is they will try anything to get this through. And they will have the impertinence to try and bring this back once again through any sort of guise that they think is going to be possible. And maybe it'll be the DUP agreeing with their deal. Could you say to us, Mr. Speaker, how you intend to be vigilant to that prospect and what criteria will be assessed if the government is going to bring back some sort of motion which they will try to present as being significantly different to their last motion? How do we judge and assess what they are doing so that this ruling can stand? Because it is an important ruling and it's a correct ruling.
It seems to me that it's principally a question of whether the proposition is the same or substantially the same. I would confer, I would of course seek advice, I would have my eyes and ears open, and I am looking to serve the House, to reflect its interests and to demonstrate respect for its wishes. I simply repeat that the Convention is there for a purpose, and that purpose seems to me to be an honourable and valid purpose. I'm afraid as to the particulars, I will have to look at them in the light of what is presented. But I would hope that the government would feel that respect for procedure does matter. And, you know, I note that as the right honourable gentleman asks his question and I respond, the Leader of the House is playing with her electronic device, and so is the Deputy Chief Whip. I didn't include him in the category of very senior people in the House, but that's a debatable proposition I readily grant. But it would seem to me to be helpful if people showed respect for each other in these circumstances, and if they were in the chamber, listened to what others had to say. But if they choose not to do so, well, so be it. I try to show good manners, and I hope others will try to do so as well. And a point of order, Mr. Robert Halfon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I understand your clarity on this. Just to confirm, given that the vote for a second referendum was overwhelmingly rejected by the House of Commons last week, does this mean that if it is brought back, you apply the same considerations so that the motion won't be repeated?
Earlier inquisitors that everything depends on the circumstance. Is the proposition fundamentally the same, or can it be argued in the circumstances of the time that it is a different proposition? And, you know, I would have to look at that. I would have to look at that in the circumstances of the time. But is it a relevant factor to be considered? Of course it is. That's why I have articulated the Convention in the way in which I have done. Yes, indeed. Point of order, Mr. Tom Brake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, Mr. Speaker, I'm wondering if you are able to update the House on any sanctions that might have been applied since 1604 to any governments that have sought to retable the same motion, and what such sanctions might be available to you today. And also, I wanted your reassurance, Mr. Speaker, that clearly we have, over a number of months, tabled a succession of amendments in relation to a people's vote, and I just wanted clarity from you that there's nothing in terms of what you said that would preclude us pressing another amendment on the matter of a people's vote.
The right honourable gentleman who asked me, it depends on the context, it depends on the circumstances. I can't yet know in what situation a proposition might be put. When the right honourable gentleman asks me about sanctions, I think what I would say to you is I'm not aware of any particular sanctions other than that if a proposition is judged to be the same or substantially the same, it doesn't find its way onto the order paper. There may be instances in which this has been dishonoured or inadvertently neglected, but I referenced in my statement the fact that the absence of Speaker intervention since 1920 is attributable not to the discontinuation of the Convention, but to general compliance with it. For the most part, the Convention has not been invoked in respect of governments, but I would argue that that is not least because, on the whole, governments have tended to comply with the Convention. Point of order, James Cleverly.
Speaker, I'm obliged. Hindsight is a wonderful thing. Do you, sir, concede that had you made this statement in fundamentally the same way as you made today, between the first and the second presentation of a meaningful vote, there might be members in this House perhaps believing that the second meaningful vote was the last opportunity they might have to vote positively on this, could have indeed changed their mind. And might I also inquire, sir, that as we have seen sometimes in particularly fast-moving negotiations, that there may be changes, substantial if subtle changes in the agreement during the stage of the debate and before the vote. And in that instance, how, sir, would you assess that in terms of the validity of another presentation of meaningful vote?
The latter point of the honourable gentleman is nuanced, and I think that it would be sensible to say, I'm afraid, because it will disappoint him, but it happens to have the advantage of being true, that I would have to look at the particulars. I cannot possibly be expected to pontificate or even to speculate idly on an abstract proposition. I would have to look at the reality of what was on the table. But what I say to the honourable gentleman in respect of his first point, and I have always had a great fondness for the honourable gentleman, is that although the Speaker tries to be helpful to the House, it is not my responsibility, and I would not ordinarily be expected, to hold members' hands in advising them of how they should vote in a particular circumstance. Members are perfectly capable of making these judgments for themselves. And the reason why I didn't make a statement at an earlier stage, I say in terms which brook of misunderstanding, is that no such statement was required, for the simple reason that I adduced in my statement that the second vote on March the 12th and the debate that preceded it were entirely proper. There was not a breach of the Convention. So for the honourable gentleman to say that it would have been helpful if I had said what I didn't say at a time that I could have said it, because it might have assisted members who, as a result of it not being said, weren't helped, is not altogether helpful, and I'm not sure that I would say that his logic is impeccable. I'm not sure that I would say his logic is impeccable. Point of order, Mr. Stephen Doughty.
Mr. Speaker, and thank you for your statement today. The government, Mr. Speaker, has gained a infamous historical reputation for trickery and abuse of Parliament during this whole process. And there are rumours already going around that they might seek to use the method of prorogation as a way of getting out of this. Now, not only would that provoke a greater constitutional crisis, but would you confirm, Mr. Speaker, that it would also result in losing every single piece of legislation currently before both houses, including many of the pieces of legislation needed to implement any Brexit?
Carryover, that would not apply. But in the expectation, let us say, or simply, I will use a more neutral term, in the circumstance that particular legislation was not subject to the carryover procedure, manifestly and incontrovertibly, it would fall. As to whether the government is contemplating that, I have no way of knowing. No minister has indicated that to me. I've no idea what is in their mind. It would be an unusual step, but look, I've been in this place now a little over 20 years and some quite unusual things have happened. I've no way of knowing whether this is being contemplated. Point of order, Sir Robert Sims.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In 1604 and in 1920, we were a sovereign parliament and we were not subject to the EU constitution, which this House voted for under the Lisbon Treaty. And this House has passed legislation under Article 50 in order for us to leave the European Union, which is time sensitive. Now, Parliament could go in a rather stately manner in 1920 because it wasn't subject to such things, but we actually, as a Parliament, have voted to leave on a particular date, and therefore there is a certain importance that decisions are made prior to that date and not in the next session. Secondly, the meaningful vote in itself is a constitutional innovation. It was this Parliament trying to impose on the government greater parliamentary scrutiny. In that process, the government has brought forward votes, in fact more votes than most of us expected, and with more amendments than most of us expected, and I think there was a degree of constitutional innovation, I think, in what you ruled in that process, Mr. Speaker, in order to involve Parliament. I can see no reason if, because of the time nature of the proposition, and because this Parliament wanted to be involved, why we shouldn't be put through the pain of maybe another vote because of the time-sensitive nature of this particular proposal. And I would stress, Article 50 went through this House, the Withdrawal Act went through this House. Every member of this House expects to have a say on the type of Brexit that we actually are going to undertake. And even if we are dealing with an issue which has been dealt with before, it is sometimes important that this House makes a decision or decides not to make a decision, but not to consider the matter again could in itself have consequences.
And one has to reflect on the particulars. What I would say to the right honourable gentleman is that the issue is not the pain of any vote, which is a subjective matter upon which I don't think I should pontificate, especially as I don't cast such, other than in the circumstances of a tie, which has not arisen, I think, since 1993 in this chamber, but its propriety. The issue is not the pain of a vote, but its propriety. It is absolutely true that the House has legislated in respect of Article 50. I believe it did so in March 2017 in the last Parliament, and that has created a very strong expectation. That is entirely true. But whether Parliament chooses to legislate on this matter, or as the government has signalled in recent days, depending upon circumstance, to request a particular extension, is a matter for the House. I don't think that the issue of pain really comes into it. It's just a question of what is proper. And I know that the honourable gentleman, whom I've known since we competed with each other in Bristol South in June 1989, is a stickler for propriety. Well, I think it would be unseemly for me to say. Unseemly for me to say. I'm asked who won. Well, it's not seemly for me to say. I think the honourable gentleman's result at the 1992 election was rather better than mine. Point of order, Kate Hoey.
Speaker, and obviously we fully endorse your statement and respect it. But could I just ask for a point of clarification, or would it be in order to ask, that I'm sure people out there will be asking when they read this today. On January the 29th, the House of Commons voted against the SNP Plaid Cymru amendment by 327 votes to 39, which ruled out an extension of the Article 50 period and ruled out no deal. So, I mean, we obviously voted again on that last week. Could you just perhaps clarify why that wouldn't have fallen into the same ruling?
I would have to look back at those particular votes. I didn't receive advice at that time about non-compliance, and I don't think there was a general sense in the House that there was an issue of non-compliance, and I wasn't asked to rule on it. Matters are already treated of by the Table Office on the basis of established custom and practice, and if those matters were accepted onto the paper, the issue of selection was an issue of selection for me in the interest of facilitating the debate, but the issue of propriety was not raised with me at that time. Yes, indeed. A point of order, Sir Hugo Swire.
Most grateful to you, Mr. Speaker. Most people watching our deliberations watch them with increased amazement, frankly. They don't understand the nuances of the twists and changes of the way we go about our business here. And to many of them, what we do at the moment makes very little sense at all. Yeah. They want to get on with things. So can I ask you, Mr. Speaker, as the custodian of the reputation of this House. Whether you really think in bringing this ruling today at this stage rather than perhaps last week, because many of us are looking forward to trying to vote again one way or another this week. And perhaps you could inform the House as to how you came to this opinion and whether it would have been better at the time of the second vote to have announced that this was not time to have a third vote.
I agree.
Well, I'm a little taken aback by the inquiry from the right honourable gentleman. I think I signalled to the honourable gentleman, the member for Braintree, why I didn't think that any statement was required at that time. It is, of course, true that the House passed a motion on Thursday that specified a potential end date for an agreement to be reached, and it specified that if an agreement was reached by that date, a particular extension, I think if memory serves me to the end of June to Article 50, would be requested of the Union. Why did I not say anything at that time? That was a motion passed, but it wasn't the motion in respect of the withdrawal agreement, and I could have had no way of knowing at that time whether revisions to the agreement or accompanying declaration would be sought, let alone obtained. So I can be expected to rule only at the material time. And if I had ruled, I hope the right honourable gentleman will forgive me because I know he has a great sense of fair play. If I had ruled last week, I think I can say with complete confidence that there would have been people accusing me of being hasty and premature and commending to me the idea of waiting. And I thought that it was appropriate to reflect on the matter over a period of days. And what I'm saying before the government has tabled a new proposition. So it seems to me timely to say it now rather than to wait several days. But to have done so several days ago did not seem to me to be warranted. I have made my best judgment in the interests of the House as an institution and of its individual members. Yes, indeed. A point of order, Mrs. Helen Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you are obviously right that the House does not wish to vote on the same proposition over and over again. Equally, I'm sure you will be aware of the fact that some honourable members were interested in meaningful votes because they would be able to vote on amendments on matters which we have not yet considered as at that time. Now, if the government is unable to make any changes to their proposition, I'm seeking your guidance as to how we might secure opportunities for voting on those alternative propositions. I heard you talk about urgent questions, but of course there's no vote on an urgent question or a statement, and a Standing Order 24 is a motion in neutral terms. The government has not been very generous recently in offering opposition day debates either. So I'm just really seeking your advice on how honourable members might proceed.
Obviously, it would be helpful to the opposition if opposition days were supplied, and that hasn't happened recently, and I've no way of knowing whether the Leader of the House has it in mind to provide for opposition days. I think colleagues would think that it was a democratic and seemly thing to do to ensure that the principal opposition party had the requisite allocation of days. So far as other business is concerned, what I would say to the honourable lady is that she should look closely at the Standing Order number 24 procedure. What she says about it is true, but I think that she should reflect upon the opportunities that the Standing Order number 24 procedure presents, because the opportunities are fuller than has traditionally been acknowledged or taken advantage of by members of the House of Commons. Point of order, Mr. John Whittingdale.
Mr. Speaker, you helpfully reminded us at the beginning of your statement of the size of the majority against the vote which took place last week. I think most observers would feel that in order for that to be turned around and for the motion to pass, it would require a significant change. And as I understand from your ruling this afternoon, if perhaps at the European Council in a few days' time a significant change could be achieved, then you would allow a further meaningful vote on that basis.
The right honourable gentleman is very fair-minded, and what's more, he's perceptive. I think I hinted at that, perhaps not with the crystal clarity that the right honourable gentleman has brought to bear on the subject, but in essence he's right. If there is a substantially different proposition put as a result of revisions sought and obtained and new agreement reached, that would constitute a new proposition to be put to the House. I would have to look at the particulars, and I'm not committing to a specific at this moment, but I think nobody could outdo the right honourable gentleman today by way of reasonableness. Well, a Kingston knight, no less. Point of order, Sir Edward Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In our current constitutional crisis, can I welcome your reaffirmation of the rule of law in this House, namely Erskine May, and the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty? Given the gravity of the situation, though, could you enlighten the House as to whether Erskine May makes any provision for a Speakers' Conference to bring together all parties in this House under your chairmanship, sir, to try to find a way forward?
Well, there can always be Speakers' Conferences, though I must say, and I don't direct this particularly at this government at all, it is a wider observation, it is a perhaps curious and quaint fact that ordinarily Speakers' Conferences are convened at the instigation of the government of the day. Indeed, I recall a particular occasion some years ago when I had some interest in the possibility of a Speakers' Conference on aspects of parliamentary power. If I say to the right honourable gentleman that the reaction at the time to my suggestion of the then Leader of the House was not wildly enthusiastic, I think I would be somewhat understating the position. But that was then, and maybe the new Leader of the House, or relatively new Leader of the House, who has been a notable reformer in other respects, will be seized by the salience of what the right honourable gentleman has commended to the House, and will feel that she could have a key role in initiating such an important constitutional development. And if she did, you know, I would be perfectly willing to play ball with it. I've no idea. It's not something she and I have discussed, but you never know. You never know. Point of order, the Leader of the House.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I just want to be very clear. I am indeed a reforming Leader of the House of Commons, and for me, treating colleagues with courtesy and respect is at the forefront of that reform, and any Speaker's Council would have to have that at its heart, and I simply would not be confident that that would be the case.
Well, so be it. I treat the House with respect. I've treated its members with respect. I chaired a previous Speakers' Conference, and there was no criticism of the way in which I did so. One reason why the Leader of the House might not be well versed in that particular Speakers' Conference and in a position to make a judgment about my chairmanship of it is very simply that it took place before the Right Honourable Lady entered the House of Commons.
Point of order.
Point of order, Dr. Matthew Offord.
This House runs on conventions, as you've already made clear in your statement today. And one of those conventions is that the Treasury bench always tells the opposition bench of statements they are going to make. So to clarify this, Mr. Speaker, can you confirm to the House that you not only informed the Leader of the House of your intention to make this statement, but also told her the contents of your statement?
He can't confirm anything of the sort, and what I would say to the honourable gentleman is that his understanding about what might happen between the usual channels is one thing. That absolutely does not apply to Speaker's statements. And if the honourable gentleman shrugs and says, why not? That has never been the case. The Speaker of the House makes statements to the House at a time when the Speaker of the House thinks that they will be of interest and benefit to the House. I am under absolutely no obligation whatsoever to pre-announce that statement either to the Leader of the House or to the Shadow Leader of the House, and I did not do so. And if the honourable gentleman, a keen student of parliamentary procedure, is offended by that fact, well, I'm sorry, and he is, of course, welcome to be offended. But there is absolutely no breach of parliamentary protocol or etiquette whatsoever. That is the reality, and I have explained the position in terms clear and unmistakable. Point of order, Mr. Grant-Davis.
Mr. Speaker, can you confirm that a meaningful vote would be intrinsically different if it included the provision for a confirmatory vote by way of a public vote?
Again, I'd have to look at the particulars. I would look at the specifics, I would assess what was being proposed, and I would make a judgment about it. I prefer at this stage to rest on what I have already said about the principle that something should be different, not the same or substantially the same. I would have to look at the specifics and the circumstances of the time. Point of order, Carol Monaghan.
Mr. Speaker, we are now 11 days, 6 hours, 21 minutes and about 40 seconds from leaving. This can be described as nothing other than a constitutional crisis. So can you advise, Mr. Speaker, how we can bring forward an emergency motion on revoking Article 50?
Well, emergency motions, and I say this as much for the benefit of people observing our proceedings as for members of the House, are capable of being requested under Standing Order number 24. The Honourable Lady will know that any member can apply for the right to conduct a Standing Order number 24 motion, can conduct a Standing Order number 24 debate on a motion, and that request is, in the first instance, submitted to me. If I decide that the application can be made in a speech of up to 3 minutes, it is made on the floor of the House. If I decide that the application is valid and the application is supported, then the debate can take place, and there's nothing to stop such debates taking place in the ensuing days. Many have taken place before, obviously on nothing like the scale of urgent questions, but many have taken place before, and I have no reason to suppose that it will be different in the future. Yes, point of order, Alex Burkhardt. Thank you.
Does this House have the authority to suspend the standing orders that prevent motions being brought back to the House in the same form again?
The Clerk of the House confirms my own understanding, which is the House is the custodian of its own standing orders. The standing orders are a matter for the House, and those standing orders can be changed. That has happened before, and conceivably it could happen again. So, in terms of the central inquiry, the answer is yes. Point of order, Hal Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is there any definition in terms of precedents of the meaning of the term substantial change? And if there is not, can you just confirm that that does not preclude you from making a novel decision?
I'm sorry if this disappoints the honourable gentleman, but it is context-specific, and it is a judgment for the Chair. And the Chair seeks to make a judgment on the basis of what is going to be in the interests of the House. I don't think I can say fairer than or different to that, and I hope that that is useful to colleagues. Point of order, Mark Pritchard.
I just wonder, for clarity, is it the case that you've not ruled out having a third meaningful vote? It is just a matter of that vote being conditional on other matters applying, in the motion as well as in the substance?
I think I explained the position to the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Malden. It depends on the specific terms of what is proposed. And in answer to the Honourable Gentleman, forgive me, and I don't mean this discourteously in any way, I don't know whether he was here throughout our exchanges. Maybe he was. No, maybe he was, I don't know. But what I was seeking to convey was that a new proposition could be put, but the convention would militate against the same or substantially the same proposition being put. So I am not closing the door, and indeed I quite specifically said towards the end of my statement, this ruling should not be regarded as my last word on the subject. It is simply meant to indicate the test which the government must meet in order for me to rule that a third meaningful vote can legitimately be held in this parliamentary session. I don't see that I can expand upon that, nor should I be required today to do so.
To be helpful, well, I think the Speaker decides. The Speaker decides. So would your advice be to those that perhaps are getting exercise about this, don't panic?
Well, I'm always inclined to say don't panic. I'm not in the business of panicking myself. I think I can safely say I've never lost a wink of sleep over any work-related matter. There is no merit or purpose in doing so. I think we should approach these matters with calm, deploy reason, and seek to make sensible judgments, not just in our own interests and in the interests of the House, but of the people that we are sent here to represent. I've always done that, and I'm sure that that is what colleagues think it is right to do, including most certainly the honourable gentleman. If there are no further points of order, I'm most grateful to colleagues for the interest that they've shown and the inquiries they've put, and I thank them for their involvement. We come now to the urgent question. Janet Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In light of the recent terrorist attacks against the Muslim community of Christchurch, New Zealand, will the Minister make a statement on the government's strategy to tackle far-right violence and online extremism in the UK?
Minister Ben Wallace.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for asking the question so the government can set on record its position towards extreme right-wing neo-Nazi and other type of violent terrorism. Mr. Speaker, the Home Secretary would have liked to have responded personally to this urgent question. However, he was visiting Regent's Park's Mosque with the Community Secretary today to show support for British Muslims following last week's horrific terrorist attack in Christchurch. The attack was a sickening act of terrorism which the government condemns, as we do the incident that's been reported in Utrecht today and the attack in Surrey on Saturday evening. Mr. Speaker, the government takes all forms of terrorism and extremism seriously. Our counter-terrorism strategy contest does not differentiate between what motivates the threat. It is designed to address all forms of terrorism, whatever the ideology, be it Islamist, neo-Nazi, far-right or extreme left-wing. If we are to tackle terrorism in the long term, Mr. Speaker, we must challenge those seeking to radicalise people. The Prevent policy is designed to safeguard our vulnerable citizens from being recruited or motivated into terrorism. That is why I always urge people to get behind the policy. Our counter-terrorism strategy is agnostic to the threat. It is not relevant to us what name terror strikes. It is the use of violence and hate that we seek to stop. Government and law enforcement will direct its funding wherever the threat emerges, and if we are to stay one step ahead, as the threat changes, so must the funding. We will continue to keep funding for protective security measures under review as that threat moves, and will indeed consistently reviewed for places of worship and other areas that may be vulnerable. Mr. Speaker, social media platforms should be ashamed that they have enabled a terrorist to live stream this evil massacre and spread this mantra of hate to the whole world. As the Home Secretary has made clear, enough is enough. We've been clear that tech companies need to act more quickly to remove terrorist content and ultimately prevent new content being made available to users in the first place. This must be a wake-up call for them to do more. There can be no safe spaces for terrorists to promote and share their sick views. The online harm white paper will be published imminently, and it will set out clear expectations for tech companies to keep users safe and what will happen if they fail to do so. Mr. Speaker, this government takes the growing threat of the extreme right wing extremely seriously, and I can assure the House and our Muslim communities that we will stand together to counter it wherever it manifests itself in our society.
Janet Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week's terrorist attacks on mosques in New Zealand killed 50 people and wounded a further 50 people. I'm sure the whole House will join me in expressing our most sincere condolences to those who have lost their loved ones, as well as our solidarity with the people of New Zealand as they come to terms with this and also put in place legislation to prevent this from happening again. We've also seen this morning where a terrorist attack took place in the Netherlands, and we offer our sincere condolences to the 3 people that have died during that. In Lewisham, we have 5 mosques, and 2 of those are in my constituency, and I've been contacted about the very real concern. This type of racial hatred and violence, whether in the UK or elsewhere in the world, must not be tolerated and should not be tolerated. It brings with it such immense fear, worry and anxiety for our Muslim communities, for families, children and young people. This should not be happening to people in this country or in other countries, and this should not be how people live. And the government needs to demonstrate everything is being considered and done to keep people safe from harm, promoting respect, acceptance of difference and others. Will the Minister therefore state how his department will deal with social media offences, including the removal of extreme content, protect free speech while developing an efficient strategy to tackle hate speech online? Also, will he confirm if he will be increasing his commitment to financing mosque security?
Minister Ben Wallace.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady makes some very valid points. First of all, on the protect, the space, the money we fund to protect vulnerable places, whether that is places of worship or schools or indeed where anyone else gathers in large public areas, we of course continue to fund that where the threat requires it. We are going to review and continue to review the Places of Worship Fund. The last round, 18-19, was not oversubscribed, despite efforts to advertise that to a number of mosques and other places of worship, and we will continue to build on that. And if there is more requirement for that, we will certainly stand ready to do that, to make sure that my constituents in Preston in their mosques and the Honourable Lady's constituents in theirs get the support they need. It is also the case, Mr. Speaker, that in every single police force there is a national counter-terrorism security advisor located within that force whose job is to go out and advise businesses, communities and places of worship about what they can do to mitigate any threat, even if it is threat unseen, but how they can make sure that the people that use their premises are kept safe. And I do urge people to do that. On top of that, the National Counter-Terrorism Security Office publishes an online manual to help places of worship, specifically with tailor-made areas. But the Home Secretary and the Community Secretary is absolutely determined to make sure that the threat we have seen in New Zealand, those type of attacks, are headed off. There are different factors at play in the United Kingdom. But nevertheless, as I have said this morning, it is perfectly possible in the future that these type of things will happen here. We are already seeing a growing threat from people moving into the extremist mindset in the extreme right wing and neo-Nazis, and that is the pool that terrorists of the future will recruit from. And unless all of us get together to make sure that we learn and teach our children about tolerance, about equality, and making sure that we understand that because someone disagrees with us, they are not lesser people. Because they come from a different religion, they are not lesser, and because they come from a different colour, they're not lesser. Until we embrace that, extremism will grow, and that's the best way we're going to head off far-right neo-Nazi extremism.
Sir Paul Beresford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the New Zealand passport in my left pocket, can I thank the House, and in fact the nation, who, with a very few exceptions, were extremely sympathetic, and it was spread throughout the media. Mr. Speaker, although the New Zealand Armed Forces and sports teams, such as the All Blacks, are fearsome in the field, as a nation, the people are known for their friendliness, acceptance of different races, of colours and religions. What is most disturbing is that even with such community integration, a case such as last week, which could not happen in New Zealand, did. The All Blacks I've just mentioned are a positive example, as they are of different races, colours and religions, but are brilliantly effective as playing as a team. On a positive point, if I could put to the Minister, I'm sure he will agree that our gun laws are very much tighter at the moment, at least in New Zealand, if not probably all nations. Would he agree that those are sufficient, but the difficulty is the importation of illegal weapons, and will he go for that rather than changing the gun laws?
Minister.
My honourable friend, as a New Zealander and a Brit, makes a valid point about the strength of the New Zealand nation. He makes the correct observation that the gun laws in this country make it much harder for people to acquire weapons that could reap murder, mass murder, in a very quick time, such as we've seen with the use of semi-assault rifles in places such as New Zealand and the United States. But that does not mean we should ever stop making sure that where those type of threats present themselves, we put all our resource and, if necessary, our legislation to restrict where necessary. I have to say that while I see many people considering those type of attacks, they have been unsuccessful in this country because they simply have not been able to get their hands on the type of weapon system we saw deployed in New Zealand, and our law enforcement agencies will continue to target both legal acquisition of weapons by unsuitable people and illegal acquisition through smuggling, so that we can make sure that our places are safer.
And Nick Thomas-Symonds.
Mr Speaker, thank you for granting this urgent question, and credit to my honourable friend for Lewisham East for applying for it. And I join all members in passing on condolences to the family and friends of those murdered in this heinous act of terror against people for no other reason other than that they were Muslims. We send sympathy to the people of New Zealand, to those affected by the incident in Surrey and the ongoing situation in Utrecht. As the Leader of the Opposition has said, an attack on anyone at worship is an attack on all peoples of faith and non-believers too, going about their lawful, peaceful business. The harrowing live streaming of events in Christchurch on the other side of the world raises questions about the role of social media platforms in facilitating a growing extremism. And whilst a white paper on online harm is of course welcome, does the Minister now accept that the time has come when asking online platforms to act is not enough, and we need a new regulator with strong powers to penalise them if they do not curb harmful content? We must also ensure our laws and policies are robust and up to date. Can the Minister clarify when the new independent reviewer of terrorism legislation will be appointed and in post? And can he also confirm that in the forthcoming independent review of the Prevent programme, lessons will be learned from both domestic and international experience? I'm not suggesting, Mr Speaker, that any political perspective has a monopoly on virtue. Rather, Mr Speaker, does the Minister agree that acts of vile hatred like this one show that we must on all sides redouble our efforts to argue for a society of tolerance and respect?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The honourable gentleman makes many points that I agree with, and tolerance and respect and the underpinning of British values of democracy and the rule of law are absolutely vital in our society, and the more we teach our children about that and the more we clamp down on those that don't believe in that, I think the better place we will be. As to his questions on the future to be appointed at some stage Prevent reviewer, independent reviewer, I can't speak for that person until we do it. No, the independent review of terrorism, we'll get to that as well. You did mention the Prevent review. I can't answer for that. However, when it comes to the review of Prevent, I want that person to be as free as possible to examine people's views, people's perceptions and people's evidence. I will hopefully would like that those who criticise Prevent the most actually produce evidence rather than anecdote at some of these events. And of course, the government will listen to whatever result. On the independent review of terrorism, it is a matter of hopefully days or weeks to do so. We are very, very advanced on the stages of selecting one, and like him, I would be grateful, I'd be very quick, I'd like to have one as soon as possible. No government benefits without a review of terrorism legislation. On the issue of new regulations to online harms, He will, I am afraid, and I know the benches opposite will be impatient, have to wait for the online harms white paper to be published. It will obviously in there examine regulation versus voluntary, and I have been on the record on numerous occasions saying that I believe that voluntary is not enough and regulation or other methods of encouragement should be explored. I've also been very clear that these online companies, many of them, are global, hugely profitable and global, and therefore whatever regulation we explore will have to be deliverable. And that's why I met with the G7 in Toronto last year to discuss what collectively the G7 can do. It's why the Home Secretary and his predecessor chairs the Global Internet Forum to make sure that countries all around the world can get to grips with this problem, and also why the European Union is taking forward plans to seek regulation in certain areas, especially around timing to take down content. Because if we are to deal with it, we do have to build an international layering approach, in my view, to regulation. Otherwise, companies will just simply move their servers or indeed escape their obligations. And it is one thing for the big companies who have a nexus here, for example, to be dealt with, but there are lots of tiny companies spreading hate around the world who may have servers in jurisdictions we cannot get to. And that is why we will have to make sure we build an international consensus to deal with the challenges.
Sir Peter Bottomley. The House will welcome the calm, purposeful way my right honourable friend has spoken here in the House this afternoon and his broadcast this morning, matched, I think, by the opposition spokesman who has shown that this is a community task. It's not just other faiths, it's the whole community who have to stand with the Muslims as we stand with the Jews. And can I in particular ask my right honourable friend if you'll go on encouraging the CST, the Community Security Trust, to share with our mosques and Islamic societies the basic steps that people can take themselves within the law to try to help raise levels of confidence and security.
My right honourable friend makes the strongest point of all, that we'll defeat this through peer group pressure and coming together to show what is not acceptable. The work that the Community Safety Trust has already offered, its download, its online material, to help advise other places of worship in how they can make themselves safe. But it is the fact that our law enforcement cannot do it on their own. The current threat is from sudden violent extremists, people who in minutes can step outside their front door, grab a knife or a car and wreak murder on our streets. That is not going to be spotted by a police officer on every corner or a large intelligence service without the support of the public, who themselves can understand their neighbours and make sure that when they have worries, they bring it to the attention of the correct authorities to make sure we say this is not acceptable.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No one who has ever visited New Zealand can fail to have been struck by the beauty of its country, but also the very warm welcome one gets from its diverse people, as the Honourable Member from Mole Valley has said. So on behalf of the Scottish National Party, I'd like to condemn the terrible evil we saw in New Zealand last week and to send our heartfelt condolences to the bereaved and injured. In Scotland, our Muslim community are a valued part of Scottish society, as they are across the whole of the United Kingdom. But we must always be aware of the particular threat posed to our Muslim community from far-right extremists. And I'm sure the Minister will agree with me that Islamophobia must be combated and condemned wherever it raises its head. Does he also agree with me that politicians, journalists and those in the public eye should always be cautious never to cross the line between free speech and fair comment, to risk stirring up the sort of hatred and othering that can feed into the narrative of the far right? There have been a growing number of incidents across the UK in recent years, and it was really good to hear the Minister on the radio this morning and this afternoon saying that he's alive to that threat and will put resources into it. I noticed on the radio this morning that the Muslim Council of Great Britain are very concerned that their community should get the same sort of funding as the Jewish community have received to protect their places of worship against attack. And I was pleased to hear the Minister say on the radio that protective security tacks with the threat present. And it seems to me that the Minister does recognise the threat, but will he confirm that he will be meeting with the Muslim Council of Great Britain to discuss their requests and to look at directing funds where needed? And finally, Mr Speaker, we've seen incidents of far-right extremists trying to intimidate and silence members of this House who've called them out for their hate. In particular, my honourable friend, the member for Glasgow South, has suffered at the hands of far-right extremists recently. I know the government have been very sympathetic about this, but does he agree with me that all of us across this House must stand united with our colleagues against the threat from the far right?
Minister. Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Honourable Lady makes some good points, and her point about Islamophobia, I have publicly spoken out for many years about the fact Islamophobia exists. It exists across our communities, it exists in all our political parties, it exists in our communities that we represent, and it exists throughout Europe and not just the United Kingdom, and we have to tackle it. And if you want a good lesson, Mr Speaker, on how to tackle intolerance, I remember one of the early successful policies of the Scottish National Party was dealing with anti-sectarianism, because the SNP recognised in Scotland that it starts with sectarianism and it grows into violent extremism. And the work, I have to commend the SNP for what they did all those years ago around that, and took strong steps, certainly amongst the football community, to stamp it out. And that is why, in the end, you have to focus upstream. You focus in the communities and say what is not acceptable, and you embrace, in my view, such policies as prevent, to make sure everyone realises it's ultimately about safeguarding. On the issue of the community trust, she's absolutely right. We will direct our funds as the threat changes, and we are completely open to learning every day from the attacks or the plots that we see either here or abroad, and we shall certainly direct it that way. My colleagues in government regularly speak with a range of Muslim communities. Many of us in this House will speak with our own communities and our own constituencies, and we will sense the current fear that there is in some of those communities as a response to the New Zealand attack. But even before that, with the growing rise of Islamophobia spread through the evils of some of these chat rooms on the internet, and if we don't all of us say that is not acceptable, as is intolerance aimed at other people in other discourse around the world, whether that is unionism, nationalism, Brexit, Remain. Intolerance is where it starts as a small seed and it grows into hate.
John Whittingdale.
Can I welcome my right friend's statement and strongly agree with him that the tech companies do need to do more to stop the spread of hate and incitement to violence. However, will he also recognise that the internet is a force for good, and that many authoritarian countries, China and now particularly Russia, are attempting to impose censorship on it for their own repressive political purposes? Does he therefore agree that any measures we take need to be proportionate and targeted, and must not allow other countries like Russia to claim somehow that they are acting for similar reasons to ourselves?
Mr Speaker, it's tempting to say to my right honourable friend, you're asking the wrong person, as the Security Minister who sees daily paedophiles, organised crime, groomers, terrorist recruiters using the internet not for a force for good. It is being used as we speak to undermine our own democracy. But he makes a valid point. In places where there is no democracy, there is no rule of law, it is their only hope sometimes, the ability to engage with free thought, to engage with the outside world. And we have to be very careful how we balance that. But nevertheless, what we know is that when these companies put their mind to it, they can remove extremist content very quickly. And there are certain areas that all of us are in agreement. Child sexual exploitation images. I can't find anyone in the world who would support allowing that to exist on our internet. Violent extremism, beheading videos, bullying online. That cannot be acceptable in any society. And I think there is certainly a number of activities that we all can agree should not be allowed or able to be on our internet without someone taking responsibility for the broadcast of it or indeed the spreading of it. And that's the fine line that we will all on this House have to try and navigate when the online white papers comes before us, and we can have debates around that.
Angela Regal.
Mr. Speaker, will the Minister admit that the Internet has allowed the formation of chat rooms such as 4chan and 8chan, online communities such as the incels, those involuntary celibates who are misogynistic and blame women for their lack of access to sex, and also the bubbles where both ISIS and now we've seen neo-Nazi far-right white supremacist groups gather their followers. And does he acknowledge and does he have a plan for dealing with the grooming and the escalation of evil and violence that is growing in these unregulated spaces?
The Right Honourable lady makes absolutely the right point, and there are a lot of characteristics across the spectrum of extremists, violent extremists, whether that is Islamist, Daesh, ISIL extremists or far-right. They often use the same methods. They often appeal to sometimes the same type of people. It is also the case that both this side of the House and her front bench have been grappling with how we deal with safe spaces, either in the material world or indeed on the online world, because it is, a characteristic of the 21st century is this safe space concept, failed state or the internet, where these people are reinforcing their prejudice and joining up. You could argue 10 years ago people sat in their bedrooms on their own and spoke to no one. Now they can speak to thousands, and that is being used to seduce people, to groom people and to twist people. So we start in our schools, and that's why I am pleased that both the state and local education authorities and primary schools start teaching children about safe use of the internet, but also, actually, some of these big CSPs, Google, Facebook, etc., do go out to schools and start that process at a young age about teaching those children about how to behave on an internet and what to be careful of. But it is a growing challenge. The online white paper hopefully will be the doorway for which we can all go through and start a big debate about how we can tackle it. But also there is this simple issue that all of us have to think about what we're looking at, what our children are looking at, what our friends are looking at actually, and ask ourselves, how are we going to stop this in this day and age where how many people in this chamber at any one time are on their telephone? Quite an awful lot.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Saturday morning, I met Muslim families from all over Essex who come to Chelmsford to meet each other. And I spoke to many leaders of the community, but also young teenage girls and other younger members of the community. And it's very clear that they're very fearful and very worried. Will my right honourable friend confirm that our Muslim constituents are our friends, our neighbours, our colleagues? They are vital to British society today, and that we as parliamentarians and members of the government will do everything to stand by them and keep them safe.
British Muslims are part of Britain. That's it. They are no lesser than any one of us. We are all the same. We all share different politics, all share different views. We all have views of the north and the south. You live in Lancashire, I have an entirely different view of the south. And my Muslims and communities in Lancashire will have a different view of the south as well. We stand shoulder to shoulder. We're not going to let these people spread their hate. We will put all the resource we need to counter it. And it's very, very much incumbent on all of us across the House to do it together. Because if we don't do it together, the bad people will exploit that difference and make it worse.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Friday night, hundreds of local residents in Walthamstow joined together in a vigil for the people of Christchurch, hearing from both our Muslim community and our New Zealand residents. And many of them were clear with me that they recognise that far-right extremism doesn't come talking about Hitler and wearing jackboots. It comes from those people who slowly drip the poison online and offline into our politics and into our discussions. And therefore it is behoving on all of us in this place to stand up to the people who lead that charge. So will the Minister tell us what he intends to do when he recognises this twisted mindset to make sure that nobody in this place gives a platform and a veneer of respectability to people like Steve Bannon, Candace Owens and Fraser Anning. Let's say they're not welcome here in this chamber and here in our country.
Minister.
The Honourable Lady presents one of the biggest challenges of today. But it is, you see that, Mr. Speaker, that is actually an immature comment, really, from someone from a sedentary position. The reality is, when we talk about tolerance, we talk about not no platforming, not shutting people up we disagree with. We talk about a discourse where we challenge people's views, because only in challenging people's views do we get to sometimes the heart of the argument and either come together or agree to disagree. If we shut people down or bully people or ridicule people, you are leading the path of intolerance. I personally find sometimes other people invited to this House unpalatable, but I don't think it is my place to shut people out of the heart of our democracy. The way we show them up is by challenging their assertions, proving it to be wrong and taking their arguments apart. That's the best way.
Julia Lopez.
The Minister is aware I was a councillor in Tower Hamlets at a time when young school children were groomed to go to Syria, and also we had far-right marches going through the borough. And it was clear from my time there just how important Prevent is in terms of giving children intellectual resilience to resist those kinds of radical and unpleasant and divisive messages. Unfortunately, however, we've seen that too often people try and spread misinformation about Prevent. Does he share my concern that politicians challenge that misinformation so that communities feel greater confidence in Prevent and feel confident enough to share the kind of critical information that stops people from falling prey to this kind of radicalisation?
Minister.
I felt that the best way for us to deal with Prevent is to publish the statistics about who is referred, how it works, and what are the outcomes. And, I think that's the best way. And no doubt, when we have an independent review of Prevent, they can examine all the evidence from both sides and make a view. The only observation I have about Prevent is I've listened to the critics over the last 2.5 years. Some of them are my friends. And when they explain, they often just explain the Prevent policy, but actually worry about the name of it. Now, that can't just be about the name, it has to be about the substance as well. And I see good results in Prevent. I've seen hundreds of people over the last 3 years who were really, really at risk of becoming terrorists, being diverted from that path, and that's over 700 people in the last 3 years who I think contribute to us being a safer society.
Sir Edward Davey.
I send on behalf of the Liberal Democrats our sincere condolences to the victims and their families and all the people of New Zealand, and say that we stand with them and all our Muslim brothers and sisters worldwide in unity. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister condemn, without reservation, Islamophobic language, whether used by individuals or in the media? Liberal Democrats have looked at the proposed definition of Islamophobia from the All-Party Parliament Group of British Muslims, and we think it's a very good one and have adopted it. Will the government do likewise?
I condemn Islamophobia. It is racism. It's like no other. It's just like any other type of racism, right? And we shouldn't even subdivide it. It is what it is. It's racism. It's like anti-Semitism is racism. So I'm not going to. I don't need to go beyond that. And anyone who is caught doing it should be called out and dealt with, whether that's in my political party or any other political party. I have absolutely no qualms with that, and they should be dealt with. On the definition of Islamophobia, I read the report that the All-Party Group produced. I looked at their definition. It is an interesting and good starting point. My Right Honourable friend, the Home Secretary, chaired, I think on the 5th of March, a round table with himself and the community secretaries and members of the Muslim community to discuss Islamophobia and what can be done in it. We are going to look at the definition and what we can do to start in that process. But I think a lot of this, all of this, Mr. Speaker, comes back to if we over-define, if we start subdividing Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, we forget what it's really about, which is tolerance. And I think it's really, really important that we accept that we are tolerant of people. That is really what underlines extremism. Where people choose not to be tolerant, they start to become extremists. And when they think they're lesser, then that's where we're in trouble.
Robert Halfon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I express
compassion and solidarity of all Muslims from New Zealand and across the world, and in my constituency of Harlow. In my constituency, we have a wonderful, thriving Harlow Islamic Centre, a small community but thriving one. But in 2013, there was an arson attack in 2013 on the Harlow Islamic Centre Mosque. Could I, honourable friend, just reset out what provision and support there is, not for the bigger mosque, but for smaller mosque and thriving communities like Harlow, to ensure that there aren't these kind of attacks happening in the future?
Minister.
Well, first of all, my honourable friend, in the Metropolitan Police there is counter-terrorism security advisors who will come out to any mosque or any place to help advise them on what steps can be taken to do that. There's also the Places of Worship scheme, 2.4 million over the last 3 years, which can be applied for. The latest round was not fully subscribed, and we will do all we can to advertise it, encourage it. And indeed, my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, and I previously have looked at different ways we can remove barriers to people applying for that to make it as easy and straightforward as possible. And we hope to improve that even more, because, like you, in my constituency, I have some very small mosques. And they are just as vulnerable as some of the very big ones, and we must make sure that protective security applies to us all.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I also add my party's the DUP sympathies to all those who were killed and injured in New Zealand in the very, very vicious terrorist attack. Coming as I do from Northern Ireland, that we have experienced unadulterated evil of people slaughtering worshippers and what should be a safe place. For example, in the Gospel Hall in Darkley on the 20th of November 1983. In the face of evil, it is time